Let's get started. Story number 1.
The old house at the end of the street had always fascinated Sarah. It was an imposing structure with tall windows, worn shutters, and a sagging porch. The kind of place that seemed to be on the verge of collapse, yet it still stood strong, looming over the neighborhood like an ancient sentinel. The rumors surrounding the house had been a part of the town's folklore for as long as Sarah could remember. Whispers of strange noises in the night, flickering lights when no one was around, and shadowy figures in the windows. But Sarah wasn't like the others. While everyone else avoided the place, Sarah was drawn to it. She had always been a skeptic when it came to ghosts and the supernatural, believing that there was always a logical explanation for everything. The house had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. So when Sarah's curiosity got the best of her one chilly autumn afternoon, she decided to explore it. Her friends had warned her, of course. "Don't go in there," they said. "You'll regret it. The place is cursed." Sarah simply laughed it off, dismissing the warnings as superstition. After all, she wasn't the type to believe in ghost stories. With her backpack slung over one shoulder, Sarah made her way down the street and towards the house. The trees lining the sidewalk were bare, their branches twisted and skeletal against the gray sky. The wind howled through the empty streets, sending leaves skittering across the pavement. As she approached the house, the familiar chill she had always felt when passing by the house intensified. It was as if the air around her had thickened, growing heavier with every step. The house loomed in front of her, its tall, broken fence barely keeping the overgrown yard contained. The windows, once clear and inviting, were now grimy and covered with thick layers of dust. The front door hung slightly ajar, as if it had been waiting for her. Sarah hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew this was a bad idea, but she couldn't turn back now. Curiosity had already taken hold of her, and there was no stopping it. Pushing the door open, Sarah stepped into the dim, musty entryway. The air inside was stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. Dust motes floated lazily in the weak light that filtered in through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. The floor creaked beneath her feet as she stepped forward, the sound echoing in the silence of the house. She felt a strange sense of unease wash over her, but she pressed on, eager to uncover whatever secrets the house held. The hallway stretched out before her, lined with faded wallpaper and old, crooked picture frames. The walls seemed to close in on her as she walked deeper into the house. At the end of the hallway, she saw a staircase leading to the second floor. The stairs groaned as she ascended, and she felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. There was something unsettling about the silence in this house, as if the very air held its breath, waiting for something to happen. As Sarah reached the top of the stairs, she noticed a door at the end of the hallway. It was slightly ajar, and she could see a dim light flickering inside. Her heart began to race as she approached the door, unsure of what she might find. She pushed it open slowly, her breath catching in her throat as she stepped into the room. The room was small, with a single window that was covered with heavy curtains. The air was colder here, and Sarah could see her breath as she exhaled. The walls were bare, except for a large, old-fashioned mirror that hung on the opposite wall. The mirror was cracked, the surface covered in a thin layer of dust. As Sarah walked closer, she noticed something strange. In the reflection, there was a faint shadow standing behind her. It was too dark to make out any details, but it looked like a figure, tall and imposing. Sarah spun around, her pulse racing, but there was no one there. Her heart thudded in her chest as she turned back to the mirror. The shadow was still there, but it seemed to be moving, slowly shifting as if it were reaching out to her. She blinked, and the shadow vanished. Her hands trembled as she wiped the sweat from her palms. There was no way that could have been real. It was just a trick of the light, a figment of her imagination. Sarah took a deep breath and forced herself to calm down. She wasn't going to let some reflection scare her, but as she turned to leave the room, she heard something. A soft, barely audible sound like footsteps echoing from somewhere deep within the house. Sarah froze. She listened closely, but the sound stopped as soon as it had started. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for the source of the noise, but there was nothing. No one was there. Still, the hairs on the back of her neck prickled, and she felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. She turned to leave the room, but before she could reach the door, she heard the footsteps again. This time, they were louder, closer. She spun around, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The room was still empty, but she could feel something, someone, there with her. The air grew colder, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow darker, more menacing. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her, making her jump. She turned the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through her as she pulled and tugged at the door, but it remained firmly closed. The footsteps grew louder, now unmistakable. Someone or something was walking toward her. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement. A shadow darted across the floor, too quick for her to catch. She whipped her head around, but there was nothing there. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she backed away from the door, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of life. The mirror, she couldn't stop looking at it. The reflection was wrong, distorted, as if the very image of the room was being twisted. And in the reflection, there was a figure. This time it was clear. A woman, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes and a mouth twisted in a silent scream. She was standing behind Sarah, her hand reaching toward her, just inches from her shoulder. Sarah spun around, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but the room was empty. She stumbled backward, her mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. It couldn't be real. She tried to calm herself, telling herself it was all in her head, but deep down, she knew something was terribly wrong. Suddenly, the room went dark. The flickering light that had been dimly illuminating the space blinked out, leaving her in complete blackness. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she fumbled for her phone, her hands shaking violently. She turned on the flashlight, casting a pale beam of light around the room. The mirror reflected her light, but the woman's image was gone. The footsteps were back, now unmistakable, echoing in the hallway outside the room. Sarah's heart raced as she backed into the corner, clutching the phone tightly. She was no longer alone. She heard a low, raspy voice whisper her name. Sarah. Her breath caught in her throat, and she turned, trying to locate the source of the voice. The shadows shifted, growing darker, swirling around her like an inescapable fog. Get out. The voice was loud now, sharp and clear, and it felt as if it were coming from within her own mind. She had no choice but to obey. Without a second thought, Sarah lunged for the door again, pulling on the handle with all her strength. This time, it gave way and she stumbled out into the hallway, her heart racing. The house seemed to shake as she bolted down the stairs, her footsteps thundering through the empty hallways. She didn't stop to look back. She just ran. The front door was still open, waiting for her, and she dashed toward it, bursting through the threshold and into the yard. She didn't stop running until she was back on the street, her lungs burning, her body trembling. When she turned to look at the house, it was silent once more, standing there like an ancient relic, as though nothing had ever happened. But Sarah knew better. She had felt it, seen it. There was something in that house, something dark and ancient that didn't want to be disturbed. She knew she would never return. Story the end.
Story number 2.
It had been a long day for Elizabeth. The drive back from the city had taken longer than expected, and by the time she reached her home in the quiet rural town, the sun was already dipping below the horizon. She was exhausted but relieved to finally be home. Her small charming cottage sat on the outskirts of the town, just past the dense woods. It had always been her sanctuary, the place she could retreat to when life got too overwhelming. But today, there was something different. Something was off, and she couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered in the pit of her stomach. Elizabeth had never been one to buy into ghost stories or paranormal happenings. She was a woman of logic, of science. Her friends would laugh when she would dismiss the tales of haunted houses or sightings of strange figures in the woods. She would chuckle along with them, always rationalizing the supernatural as figments of overactive imaginations or the result of too many scary movies. But that night, as she unpacked her things and settled into the warmth of her cozy home, something felt undeniably wrong. She tried to ignore the feeling, attributing it to fatigue, but the eerie silence of the cottage was unsettling. The house, though quaint, often felt alive with creaks and groans of the old wood as it settled. But tonight, It was different. The silence seemed heavier, thicker, as if the very air around her was holding its breath. After a quick dinner of leftovers, Elizabeth sat in her favorite chair by the window, staring out at the darkening sky. The wind had picked up, causing the branches of the trees outside to sway and scrape against the walls. She sighed, trying to relax, but her thoughts kept returning to the strange sense of discomfort that clung to her. As the night wore on, Elizabeth decided to turn in. She climbed into bed, hoping a good night's sleep would clear her head. The room was cold, despite the heat she had turned on earlier, and the old radiator let out its usual comforting hiss. She pulled the thick blankets around her, closing her eyes and trying to drift off. But sleep didn't come easily. She tossed and turned, the unease creeping back into her mind. At one point, she thought she heard something. A faint sound, almost like a whisper. But when she sat up and listened carefully, all she could hear was the wind and the sound of the radiator. She told herself it was just the house settling, but she couldn't ignore the sense of being watched. The feeling grew stronger as the night went on. Elizabeth could feel the weight of the silence, as if something was standing just outside the door, waiting. She pulled the covers tightly around herself, staring into the dark corners of the room, her heart pounding in her chest. Suddenly, there was a loud thud from downstairs. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. She lay still, straining to hear any further sounds. It came again, louder this time, followed by a soft, shuffling noise. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was the wind or an animal outside? No, the noise was too deliberate, too distinct. Terror began to grip her as she slowly rose from the bed, her legs unsteady. She grabbed a flashlight from the nightstand and, with trembling hands, crept toward the door. The floorboards creaked under her weight as she moved carefully toward the staircase. The house felt suffocating, the air thick with tension. She reached the top of the stairs and stood there for a moment, straining her ears. The house was eerily quiet again, but the sense of unease had only intensified. She hesitated before slowly making her way down the stairs, the beam of the flashlight shaking in her hand. Every step seemed to echo in the stillness of the house. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, she stood in the hallway, her heart pounding. The sound had stopped, but she wasn't convinced. She glanced at the closed door to the living room. That's where the noise had come from. Elizabeth took a deep breath and slowly approached the door. Her hand hovered over the doorknob, her heart racing. She felt a cold shiver run down her spine as she twisted the handle and pushed the door open. What she saw made her blood run cold. The room was exactly as it had been when she had left it earlier. Nothing seemed out of place. But on the floor, just inside the room, was a single shoe. Her shoe. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat as she knelt down to pick it up. How had it gotten there? She was certain she had left it by the door earlier, but now it was several feet away. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as she examined the room, searching for any signs of an intruder. The floor was undisturbed. No windows were open. There was no sign that anyone had been in the room. But then she noticed something else. A faint, almost imperceptible scent in the air. It was sweet, but sickly, like rotting flowers. The smell seemed to come from nowhere, wafting through the room, filling her nostrils. Her breath quickened, and she stepped back from the door, clutching the shoe to her chest. She needed to get out of the room, out of the house, but as she turned to leave, something caught her eye. The hallway was dark, too dark for the middle of the night. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was as if the darkness itself had weight, as though it were pressing in on her. And then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it. A figure. It stood at the far end of the hallway, just past the stairs, a tall silhouette cloaked in shadow. Elizabeth froze, her heart hammering in her chest. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there, watching her. The cold chill that had been creeping around her grew more intense, as if the figure was drawing all the warmth from the room. "Hello?" Elizabeth called out, her voice trembling, but there was no response. The figure remained motionless, like a shadow that had been cast in the middle of the night. She took a step back, her mind racing. She was imagining things. She had to be. There was no one in the house, no one but her. But then, the figure moved. It didn't walk, it glided, silently, toward her. The air grew even colder as it neared, and Elizabeth's breath came out in short, panicked gasps. Without thinking, she turned and ran. Her footsteps pounded on the floor as she raced back up the stairs, slamming the door behind her as she entered her bedroom. She locked it, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the bolt. But even as she secured herself in the room, she knew it wouldn't be enough. The house wasn't empty. It never had been. For hours, Elizabeth lay awake, clutching the blankets around her as the cold filled the room. She heard no more noises, no footsteps, no whispers, but the oppressive feeling of being watched never left. The darkness outside her window seemed to press closer, as though the night itself was creeping into her room. When morning finally arrived, Elizabeth couldn't bring herself to leave the safety of her bed. She was exhausted, physically and emotionally drained, but she knew she couldn't stay. She couldn't stay in a house that wasn't hers anymore, a house that felt alive with something she couldn't explain. As she packed her things, Elizabeth's thoughts drifted back to the house's history. She had done her research when she first moved in, wanting to know more about the place. It had been built over 100 years ago, and while there were no formal reports of any tragedies or deaths in the home, there were whispers. Whispers of strange occurrences, things moving on their own, shadows in the corners of rooms, and most chilling of all, the repeated reports of footsteps when no one else was around. The previous owners had all left abruptly, one after another, never returning to the home after they had gone. Some had mentioned hearing voices in the walls. Others claimed they had seen things that couldn't be explained. But Elizabeth had dismissed all of it. She was a rational person after all. Ghosts didn't exist. People simply got scared, their minds playing tricks on them. But now, standing in the middle of the house she once considered home, Elizabeth wasn't so sure anymore. With one last glance around the room, she grabbed her things and left the house behind. She didn't look back, but as she stepped out into the morning light, she felt the coldness from inside follow her, like a shadow she couldn't escape. Story the end.
Story number 3.
It was early spring when Sarah first moved into the old house on Crescent Hill. The house was everything she had dreamed of. Quiet, secluded, with a large yard and enough space for her to work from home in peace. The moment she saw it, she knew it was the perfect place to escape the hustle and bustle of city life. The previous owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Thorne, had passed away the previous autumn, and her family had been eager to sell the house quickly. Sarah was the only one who had shown interest, and the deal was made swiftly. At first, everything seemed perfect. The air was crisp, the house was beautiful despite its age, and the neighborhood was peaceful. There were a few things about the house that felt a little odd. Small things, really. The doors creaked more than she'd expected, and the old wooden floors groaned as if they had their own language. The house was built in the late 1800s, so it had that distinct, musty smell that came with age. But Sarah, a practical woman, chalked it all up to the house's history. It wasn't long before Sarah began to feel watched. It started small. One evening she could have sworn she heard faint footsteps behind her as she moved from room to room. She'd turned, but there was never anyone there. She brushed it off, telling herself it was just the house settling. She had heard those noises in other old houses before, so it wasn't anything unusual. But then came the dreams. Every night, Sarah found herself dreaming of a woman she had never met. In her dreams, the woman would stand at the foot of her bed, staring at her with cold, unblinking eyes. Sarah never saw her face clearly, but there was always something about her presence that unsettled her. The dreams grew more vivid, and the woman began to speak. "Help me," she would whisper. Sarah would wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding in her chest. But when she looked around the room, it was always empty. No one was there. Yet, the sense of dread remained, lingering in the corners of her mind. One morning, after waking from another restless night, Sarah decided to do a little research about the house and its previous owner. She was sure that Mrs. Thorne had lived there alone for many years, but there had to be more to the story. The house had stood for over a century, and she was curious about its history. A quick search online revealed a handful of local news articles about the house, but most of them were about Mrs. Thorne's passing. The last article she found, however, caught her attention. It was a small, faded piece from the local paper, dated over 50 years ago. The headline read, "Tragic Fire Claims the Life of Local Woman in Historic Home." The article described a fire that had consumed the house many years ago, claiming the life of a woman named Eleanor Graham. The fire had started in the middle of the night, and despite the best efforts of neighbors and firefighters, the house was mostly destroyed. Eleanor had died in the blaze, though no one knew exactly how or why the fire had started. There were rumors of foul play, but nothing ever came of the investigation. Sarah felt a chill crawl up her spine as she read the article. Eleanor Graham. It was the same woman who had appeared in her dreams. The name matched, and the timeline seemed to line up. Sarah couldn't help but feel that there was some connection between the fire and the strange occurrences she had been experiencing in the house. But what was it? Why was Eleanor's spirit still lingering? Determined to uncover the truth, Sarah visited the local library that afternoon, hoping to find more details about Eleanor's life. The librarian, a kindly woman named Mrs. Jensen, was happy to assist Sarah. After pulling out several old records and newspapers, Mrs. Jensen handed Sarah a faded photograph of Eleanor, taken in front of the very house Sarah now called home. "Here," Mrs. Jensen said softly. "Eleanor Graham. She was quite a character in her day. Lived here most of her life. She was an artist, I believe. Painted portraits and landscapes. People said she had a mysterious side to her, though." Sarah studied the photograph. Eleanor was a striking woman with sharp features and dark, piercing eyes. She had a solemn expression, as if she carried the weight of the world on her shoulders. It was a haunting photo, one that sent an unease down Sarah's spine. "She was the one who lived here before Mrs. Thorne, wasn't she?" Sarah asked. "Yes, that's right," Mrs. Jensen replied. "Eleanor passed away in that fire, but some of the locals believed she was... well, she wasn't exactly alone in the house." Sarah raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Jensen hesitated for a moment before continuing. There were rumors that Eleanor had been involved with someone, a man named Charles. They were often seen together, but after the fire, no one really knew what happened to him. Some people believe he might have been the one responsible for the fire, but no one ever found proof. Sarah's curiosity deepened, but she could sense the weight of the conversation. It was as if Mrs. Jensen was holding back something, reluctant to speak the truth. "I don't mean to pry," Sarah said gently, "but do you know anything more about the fire? About what happened to Eleanor?" Mrs. Jensen looked around the library as if ensuring no one else was listening, and then leaned closer. "Some say that Eleanor never truly left the house, that her spirit still haunts it. After the fire, people reported strange things, voices, flickering lights, cold spots. They thought it was her, still trapped in the house." Sarah's blood ran cold. She had heard the same things, but until now she had dismissed them as just rumors. Now it seemed as though the very house she had moved into might be haunted by the woman in her dreams. "I've got to go," Sarah said, suddenly feeling overwhelmed. "Thank you for your help." Mrs. Jensen gave a kind smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Be careful, dear. Some stories are better left untold." Later that night, Sarah stood in her bedroom, staring at the empty space where Eleanor's figure often appeared in her dreams. The thought of the woman's restless spirit wandering the house sent a shiver down her spine. But she couldn't shake the feeling that Eleanor needed something from her. She needed to understand what had happened, to put the spirit to rest. That night, Sarah decided to confront the ghost. She didn't know how or why, but something inside her told her she had to. She waited until the house was quiet, the only sound being the distant wind rustling the trees outside. Then she stood in the center of the room and spoke aloud, her voice steady but trembling. "I know you're here," she said softly. "I know what happened to you, and I want to help you." For a long moment there was no response. Sarah held her breath, waiting, her heart pounding in her chest. Then she heard it. A whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. "Help me." The voice was faint, but Sarah could feel it deep in her chest. The air grew colder, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, twisting like dark tendrils. "I'll help you," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "Tell me what you need." The room grew colder still, and for a moment, Sarah thought she saw a figure in the corner of the room. The woman from her dreams, her face barely visible, but her eyes locked onto Sarah's. Sarah stepped closer, heart racing. I need to know what happened," Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse. "Why did the fire happen? What happened to Charles?" There was a long silence. The temperature in the room dropped dramatically, and Sarah could feel the weight of the ghost's presence. The figure of Eleanor began to shift, her features becoming clearer, her expression one of anguish and pain. Slowly, as if the very air around her was thickening with sorrow, Eleanor's voice filled the room. He left me. He was supposed to be with me. He promised, but he wasn't there when the fire started. I couldn't escape. I couldn't get out. And then I died, but I never left." The voice was barely a whisper, but the words tore through Sarah's heart. She felt the intense grief in those words, the unresolved pain of a life cut short by betrayal and death. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know." For a moment, everything was still. Then the air in the room seemed to lighten, and the oppressive weight that had clung to the house began to lift. Eleanor's figure faded into the shadows, her presence slowly dissipating. "I'm free," the voice whispered one last time. Sarah stood there, trembling, unsure of what had just happened. But when she turned to look around the room, everything was silent. The house, for the first time since Sarah had moved in, felt peaceful. It was the beginning of the end of her time at Crescent Hill. The house had given up its secrets, and Sarah had done what she could to help. The restless spirit of Eleanor Graham had found peace at last. Story the end.
Story number 4.
It was a late fall evening when Emily first noticed something strange in her new home. She had just moved into a small 2-story house in the outskirts of a quiet town, far from the bustling city where she'd spent most of her life. The house was perfect for her. Small, cozy, with a fenced-in yard, and most importantly, it was affordable. After months of searching for the right place, she had finally found it. The house had character, even if it did have some quirks. It was old, built in the early 1900s, and came with a history, though Emily didn't know much about that yet. The house's previous owners had left abruptly, leaving a vague note behind that mentioned nothing more than life changes. Emily didn't think much of it at the time. She had seen far stranger things during her apartment hunting days. The house was perfect for a fresh start. After moving in and setting up, Emily felt an odd sense of contentment. The small, rural town felt welcoming, and the neighbors seemed friendly. Everything was going well. But it didn't take long for Emily to start feeling uneasy. The first incident was subtle. One evening, after a long day at work, Emily entered the kitchen to find the cabinets slightly ajar. She thought it was just her forgetfulness. Maybe she hadn't closed them properly earlier. But the next day it happened again, and again the day after that. At first, it was just the cabinets in the kitchen. Then the bathroom door would creak open during the night, even though it was securely shut when she went to bed. Emily told herself it was nothing. A shift in the house's old frame, perhaps. The house settled, and doors and cabinets moved. But as the days wore on, strange things started happening more frequently. The lights flickered in the hallways, and sometimes she'd hear soft footsteps when she was alone. It was never anything definitive, just enough to make her question her sanity. One night, while sitting in her living room, reading a book, Emily heard a loud crash from upstairs. Her heart jumped in her chest as she set the book down and ran toward the stairs. When she reached the top, she could see nothing out of place. The hallway was still, but the floor creaked with every step she took. She checked the bathroom and the guest bedroom. Nothing seemed amiss. It was as if the crash had never happened. She stood there, listening, trying to figure out where the noise had come from. Nothing. Her mind began to race. Could it have been the wind, or perhaps the house shifting in the cold? But as Emily turned to go back down the stairs, something caught her eye. In the corner of the hallway, near the old armoire, there was a faint shadow, darker than the rest of the shadows in the dim light. She froze, staring at the corner, the hairs on the back of her neck prickling. The shadow didn't move, but it seemed wrong. It wasn't a trick of the light. Emily shook her head, convincing herself it was nothing. She hurried back downstairs, trying to push the thought out of her mind. But as she descended, she glanced up once more. The shadow was gone. The days that followed only increased her unease. One evening, after returning home late from work, Emily walked into the kitchen and noticed something was different. The table, which she had left cluttered with her mail, had been cleared. Her plates were stacked neatly in the sink, and the leftover takeout containers were gone. She was certain she hadn't done it herself. She had been too tired to even think about cleaning up. She called out, "Hello?" but no one answered. Her immediate thought was to check the doors to make sure they were locked. Maybe a neighbor had come by to check on her, though she didn't know why they would clean her kitchen. But when she checked all the windows and doors, they were securely shut. No sign of anyone. Emily's mind raced. She had to be imagining things. The house was old. Maybe the old floorboards had made noises she wasn't used to. But the feeling of someone else being there, of a presence she couldn't explain, lingered. 2 weeks after moving in, Emily woke up to the sound of whispering. It was faint at first, like a soft murmur coming from somewhere within the house. She was too groggy to make out the words, but the sound was distinct enough to pull her out of sleep. The whispers grew louder, almost as if they were calling her name. Emily, Emily. Startled, she sat up in bed, scanning the dark room. Her heart raced as she listened. The whispering stopped. Silence. Then, a soft, almost imperceptible knock at the door. Her pulse quickened as she glanced toward the door. There was no way anyone could have entered her room. She was the only one in the house. Still, she didn't want to check. She was afraid of what she might find. But when the knocking came again, louder this time, Emily knew she had to see. She grabbed the lamp beside her bed, turned it on, and slowly approached the door. Her breath was shallow, her hand trembling as she reached for the doorknob. She opened the door. Nothing. Emily stared into the dimly lit hallway. It was quiet. No one was there. Confused and shaken, she closed the door again, locking it behind her. She sat back down on the bed, trying to convince herself that it was just a dream, a product of her overactive imagination. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. The next few days were a blur of strange occurrences. One night, she heard someone softly humming a lullaby from the kitchen. She convinced herself it was just the sound of the wind outside, playing tricks on her mind. But when she went to check, there was no one there. She tried to tell herself it was just the house settling, but the feeling of being watched persisted. One afternoon, Emily came home from work to find that the house was colder than usual. The thermostat was set at a comfortable 72 degrees, but the chill in the air was unmistakable. She walked through the hallway, trying to ignore the creeping sensation that she wasn't alone, and entered the kitchen. That's when she saw it. A photograph, once sitting on the counter next to the refrigerator, was now on the floor. It had been placed perfectly in the center of the kitchen, facing upward as if someone wanted her to see it. The photo was of Emily and her family, taken on a trip years ago, before she had moved away. She stared at it for a moment, her mind spinning. She hadn't left the photograph there that morning. In fact, she hadn't seen it in weeks. Suddenly, the door behind her slammed shut, causing her to jump in fright. She spun around, heart pounding, but when she looked at the door, there was nothing unusual. She could no longer ignore the truth. Something was wrong with this house. It wasn't just her imagination. The house was haunted. That night, unable to sleep, Emily did some research. She dug through old town records and discovered something chilling. The house had a dark history. It had once belonged to a family in the early 1900s, the Holloways. The father, Samuel Holloway, was known to be a troubled man, and rumors had circulated that he had been abusive toward his wife, Eleanor. There were whispers that he had locked his wife in the attic before disappearing without a trace. Eleanor's body was found years later, her skeletal remains hidden away in the attic. Some said she had died of starvation. Emily sat back in her chair, her stomach churning. The house had been built on tragedy. The restless spirits of Samuel and Eleanor Holloway seemed to have never left. The more Emily learned, the more she realized she could no longer stay in the house. She had to leave, but the fear of being trapped in that house with whatever haunted it was overwhelming. The house itself seemed to want her to leave, to get out of its way. The final straw came one night when Emily saw the figure, an apparition in the hallway. She had been sitting on the couch, staring at the television when she saw a shadow flicker across the wall. Her blood ran cold as the figure materialized in front of her. It was a woman, her pale face obscured by long, matted hair. Her eyes were hollow, her skin thin and lifeless. She seemed to glide, her form wavering as she moved closer to Emily, her mouth moving but no sound escaping. With a scream, Emily bolted from the couch and ran out of the house, her heart racing. She didn't look back as she fled to the safety of a neighbor's house. The next morning, Emily didn't return. She packed up her belongings and left the house behind, moving to another town far away. The house was eventually sold again, though no one stayed in it for long. And though Emily tried to forget, the image of the hollow-eyed woman lingered in her mind. She would always remember that cold presence, the dark history, and the feeling of being watched. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The small town of Ravenswood had always been quiet, nestled between the rolling hills and dense forests. Its residents were a close-knit community where everyone knew each other by name, and the townspeople were always willing to lend a helping hand. But there was one house in Ravenswood that stood out from the rest. It was an old Victorian home at the end of Maple Street, known for its eerie appearance and the whispers of strange happenings that surrounded it. The house had been abandoned for years, ever since the death of its last occupant, Mrs. Abigail Monroe, a woman who had lived there alone for as long as anyone could remember. The house itself had a dark history, with rumors of unexplained noises, flickering lights, and odd occurrences that seemed to unsettle even the bravest of souls. But for Sarah, the house was more than just a curiosity. She had grown up hearing the stories about the Monroe house, how the floors creaked at night, how the windows would sometimes glow in the dark, how people claimed to have seen shadows moving behind the curtains. She had always been fascinated by the idea of ghosts and the supernatural, and the Monroe house seemed like the perfect place to investigate. One summer evening, when Sarah was in her early 20s, she decided to gather her courage and venture into the house. She had heard that some of the local teenagers had dared each other to spend the night there, but no one had ever lasted long enough to tell their story. The thought of uncovering the truth behind the rumors filled her with a mix of excitement and fear. She wanted to see for herself whether the house was truly haunted or just a product of imagination. Sarah's friends were hesitant to join her, but she was determined. Armed with a flashlight, a camera, and a notebook to document her findings, she made her way to the Monroe house one evening just as the sun began to set. The house loomed before her, its dark silhouette framed against the fading light of day. The front yard was overgrown with weeds, and the porch was sagging, as though the house itself was slowly collapsing into the earth. As she stepped onto the creaky wooden porch, Sarah's heart began to race. The door was slightly ajar, and a cold draft seemed to escape from inside, carrying with it the faint smell of mildew and dust. She hesitated for a moment, her hand resting on the doorknob before pushing the door open and stepping inside. The house was dark, save for the light of her flashlight cutting through the gloom. The air was thick and musty, and the silence was almost oppressive. The floors groaned beneath her feet as she made her way into the foyer, the shadows seeming to stretch and shift with every step. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, and old portraits of long-dead ancestors hung crookedly on the walls, their eyes following her as she moved through the room. The faint sound of footsteps echoed from upstairs. Sarah froze. She couldn't be hearing that. The house had been abandoned for years, and there was no one else here. Her mind raced as she tried to rationalize the sound, but deep down, she knew something wasn't right. She turned her flashlight toward the staircase, which wound upward into the darkness. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, as if someone was walking just out of sight. Despite the fear creeping up her spine, Sarah couldn't turn back now. She had to know what was causing the noise. She cautiously ascended the stairs, each step creaking loudly in the silence of the house. The air grew colder the higher she went, and her breath fogged in the chill. The footsteps stopped as she reached the top of the stairs, and for a moment everything was still. She turned down the hallway, her flashlight sweeping over the old, dust-covered furniture. It was as though time had stood still in this house, frozen in place since Ms. Monroe had passed away. The rooms were full of forgotten treasures, old books, faded curtains, a broken mirror. But it wasn't the objects that caught her attention. It was the sound again, coming from the end of the hall. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper. "Help me." The voice was faint but clear, and it sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. She couldn't tell if it was the wind, her imagination, or something else entirely, but it was enough to make her heart race. She moved toward the voice, her footsteps now a little quicker, more urgent. The hall seemed to stretch before her, as if the house was playing tricks on her, making her feel as though she was walking for miles. When she reached the last door at the end of the hall, it was slightly ajar, just like the front door had been. Sarah pushed it open and stepped into the room. It was a bedroom, and though the room was covered in dust and cobwebs, there was something different about it. The air felt heavier here, as though the room itself was holding its breath. The room had an old-fashioned feel to it, with a large four-poster bed in the center and a vanity against the wall. But what drew Sarah's attention was the window. The curtains were drawn, but the window itself was wide open, letting in a cold breeze. It was then that she saw it. In the reflection of the glass, a figure stood behind her. A woman, pale and ghostly, with long, dark hair that hung loosely around her face. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she spun around, her flashlight shaking in her hand. But the room was empty. There was no one there. Panic set in. Her pulse raced and her mind screamed at her to leave, but her body refused to obey. She turned back toward the window, trying to rationalize what she had seen. It was just a reflection, a trick of the light. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. There was something in this house, something old, something sad, something angry. She could feel it in the air, thick and suffocating. As she moved toward the door, her flashlight flickered. The beam of light sputtered and died, leaving her in complete darkness. Her heart pounded in her chest as she fumbled with the flashlight, trying to get it to work again. It wouldn't turn back on. Then she heard it again. The whisper. Clearer this time. Louder. Help me. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as the temperature in the room dropped drastically. She could see her breath now, fogging in the air. The whispering grew louder, closer, as if the voice was standing right behind her. She spun around, her body trembling with fear, but the room was still empty. Except for the woman. The figure in the mirror was there again, closer this time. Her face was clearer, though it was distorted with grief and anger. The woman's eyes were wide, her mouth stretched in an agonizing scream. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure vanished, leaving Sarah standing alone in the dark room, gasping for air. She didn't know how long she stood there, frozen in fear, but when she finally managed to gather the courage to move, she bolted for the door, not caring if she tripped or stumbled over the furniture. She needed to get out. As she reached the stairs, she heard the whisper one last time, clear as day. Help me. Sarah ran down the stairs, the sound of her footsteps pounding in her ears as she rushed for the front door. The house seemed to resist her, as though the walls themselves were trying to hold her back. But she pushed forward, her body screaming in protest, and finally burst out the door into the cool night air. She didn't stop running until she was safely back at her car, the engine roaring to life as she sped away from the house. The image of the woman's face, twisted in pain and sorrow, was burned into her mind. She never returned to the Monroe house again. In the days that followed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her, watching from the shadows. And though she never spoke of it to anyone, she couldn't deny the truth. The Monroe house was haunted, and the spirit of Abigail Monroe, or whatever she had become, still lingered, waiting for someone to help her, even if that help came too late. Story, the end.
Story number 6.
I moved to a small town in the Pacific Northwest, seeking peace and quiet after years of living in a bustling city. I had no particular reason for choosing this place, just a random decision that seemed right at the time. The house I rented was an old 2-story Victorian with large windows, high ceilings, and a wraparound porch. It was charming in a way that made me feel nostalgic, as though it had a history, one that I wasn't sure I wanted to explore too deeply. I didn't know anyone in town, so I figured I would spend my time working and maybe make some new acquaintances. The town was small, and the house was on the outskirts, surrounded by woods and overgrown fields. The silence at night was almost deafening. At first, things were normal. The house was quiet, but I didn't mind it. It was the kind of place that felt like it had seen better days, but still carried a certain charm. The wood floors creaked, the windows rattled in the wind, and the old staircase groaned underfoot. But None of it was alarming, just the sounds of an old house settling. It was a peaceful retreat from the chaos of city life. I was working from home most days, spending my time in the large, sunlit study at the front of the house. I had a desk by the window overlooking the woods, and it became my favorite spot. There was something about the view that soothed me. Tall trees swaying in the breeze, the occasional deer wandering through the yard, and the distant sound of birds. But it wasn't long before I began to notice things. Little things, at first. The first strange occurrence happened during the second week I was there. I had left the study to grab a cup of coffee from the kitchen. When I returned, I found the chair at my desk turned around, facing the opposite direction. I was certain that when I had left, it had been facing the window, as it always was. I shrugged it off, thinking perhaps I had forgotten to adjust it properly, or that the cat had knocked it over when I wasn't looking. But the feeling lingered. There was something about it that didn't sit right with me. A few days later, I woke up in the middle of the night to hear soft whispering. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or perhaps I was still half asleep, but the whispers grew clearer. It wasn't a language I could recognize, but the tone was unmistakable, low, urgent, like someone was trying to communicate something important. I lay there, frozen, listening as the whispers seemed to come from just outside my bedroom door. My heart raced and my skin prickled with unease. I tried to tell myself it was my imagination, that it was just the house settling, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was there. The next day, I mentioned it to a neighbor I had met in passing, an older woman named Mary who lived a few houses down. She seemed nice enough, but when I brought up the noises, her expression changed. She didn't say much at first, just nodded slowly, but I could tell she wasn't surprised. After a long silence, she asked me if I had heard any other unusual sounds. I told her about the whispers, and she looked at me with a knowing expression. "This house," she said, her voice low, "it has a history. I didn't want to scare you, but you should know, but now people say it's haunted. The last people who lived there, well, they left pretty suddenly." I pressed her for more details, but she wouldn't say much more. She seemed reluctant to discuss it, as if she feared it would somehow bring the past back. The conversation left me unsettled, but I didn't know what to think. Could the house really be haunted? I didn't believe in ghosts, or at least I thought I didn't. I was pragmatic, scientific. The whispers, the chair moving, those were just coincidences, right? A few days later, I decided to explore the house more thoroughly. I had been so focused on work and settling in that I hadn't taken much time to really look around. The house was big, and I had only explored the main floor and a couple of rooms upstairs. I started with the basement, which had a heavy old door that creaked when I opened it. The smell hit me immediately, musty, damp, like the air hadn't moved in years. The basement was cluttered with old furniture, boxes, and stacks of things that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. I was about to turn around and leave when something caught my eye. A small, faded photograph tucked behind a pile of boxes. I picked it up, brushing off the dust, and looked at it closely. It was a black and white photograph of a family, 2 parents and a young child. The parents looked stern, their eyes cold and distant, while the child had a curious look on their face, staring directly at the camera. The photograph wasn't recent, and the house in the background was unmistakably the one I was standing in. I turned it over, hoping to find a name, but there was nothing written on the back. It didn't seem like much, just an old family photo, but something about it unsettled me. I couldn't explain why, but it felt like I wasn't supposed to have found it. Later that evening, I was sitting in the study again, trying to focus on work, when I heard something else. This time it was more distinct, more tangible. Footsteps. I could hear them clearly, coming from upstairs, echoing in the stillness of the house. Slow, deliberate steps like someone walking around, pacing back and forth. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood up, straining to listen. The footsteps continued for a few moments before they stopped suddenly. The silence that followed was deafening. I hesitated before slowly making my way upstairs, my mind racing with a mix of curiosity and dread. I reached the top of the stairs and looked down the hallway. There were no lights on, except for the faint glow coming from the study at the far end. I took a deep breath and walked down the hallway, but when I reached the last room on the right, the one that used to be a nursery, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The door was slightly ajar, and I could feel the air grow colder the closer I got to it. I pushed the door open, and the room was empty. The only thing in the room was an old crib, covered in dust, the wooden slats darkened with age. My mind raced as I stood there, trying to make sense of what I was feeling. I didn't want to be there anymore. I didn't want to feel like something was watching me, but I couldn't leave. That night, I decided to do some research. I dug into the history of the house, combing through old town records and speaking to more neighbors. The more I learned, the more disturbing the story became. The house had been built in the early 1900s, and it had seen several owners, many of whom had lived there for only a short time before moving away. The most recent tenants, however, had been a young couple with a child. They had lived in the house for a few years, but suddenly, without warning, they disappeared. No one knew what happened to them. The only thing left behind were their belongings, abandoned in the house. It didn't take long for me to find out what had happened to the family. A neighbor had told me that the couple had been involved in a tragic accident. The child had died in a fire that started in the nursery, and the parents had never recovered from the trauma. The official story was that they had moved away, but the truth was darker. They had been so devastated by the loss of their child that they had simply disappeared, leaving everything behind. I was shaken. The whispers, the footsteps, the cold spots, all of it made sense now. The house was haunted by the spirits of the family that had once lived there. The child's tragic death had left an imprint on the house, and the parents' sorrowful presence lingered in the walls. I couldn't explain it any other way. From that night on, things escalated. The whispers became louder, more insistent, as though they were trying to communicate something important. The footsteps grew more frequent, and at times I felt a cold hand brush against my arm when I least expected it. I tried to leave the house, to go somewhere safe, but something kept pulling me back. It was as if I couldn't escape, no matter how hard I tried. Eventually, I reached out to a local paranormal investigator, hoping they could help. They arrived with their equipment, EMF detectors, cameras, and voice recorders, and began their investigation. What they captured on tape still haunts me to this day. The child's voice, soft and playful, could be heard on the recorder, calling for its parents, and in the background there was a faint, sorrowful whisper, the voice of the mother, still searching for her child. I moved out of the house shortly after that. The presence in the house had become too much to bear. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was never alone, that the spirits of the family still roamed the halls, unable to find peace. I often think about the house, about the family, and about the secrets it holds within its walls. I don't know what happened to the parents after they left, but I hope they found peace. As for the child, I like to think that they're still waiting, still calling for their parents, in the place where it all ended. Story the end.
Story number 7.
The air in the old house was thick with dust and the scent of long-forgotten memories. Sarah stood at the edge of the front yard, staring at the house across the street. It was a familiar house, one that had been there her whole life, yet it was also something entirely foreign. Her parents had always told her to stay away from it. It's not a place for kids, they'd say, their voices full of something that wasn't quite fear, but wasn't entirely casual either. The house had been abandoned for years, ever since the last owner, an old man named Mr. Blackwell, had passed away. Sarah's parents, like most of the town's residents, assumed that it would be sold. Someone would come in and clean it up, maybe fix it up, but nothing ever happened. The house simply remained, empty, silent, and increasingly mysterious. As Sarah looked up at the darkened windows, a shiver ran down her spine. She wasn't sure what had drawn her here today. Something inside of her had always wanted to explore it, to find out if the stories about the house were true. After all, there were stories. Everyone in town knew at least one. Stories of strange noises at night, of lights flickering in empty rooms, of cold spots and whispers that came from nowhere. It was a Saturday afternoon, and the air felt heavier than usual, like it was holding its breath. Sarah had always been the curious one in her family, the one who wasn't satisfied with vague explanations. Her brother Tim, who was a few years older, had already gone off to college, leaving her alone at home. It was the perfect opportunity for an adventure. She had just left her house, but when she arrived at the foot of the worn-down steps leading to the front porch, doubt crept in. The front door, slightly ajar, creaked as the wind pushed against it. A few more steps forward, and she'd be inside. There were no more excuses. And then it happened. From somewhere deep inside the house, she heard a faint sound. It was so quiet at first that she thought it was just her imagination, maybe the wind or a loose shutter rattling against the house. But then it came again, a soft, rhythmic thud like footsteps, slow and deliberate. Sarah froze. The house had been empty for years. It wasn't possible that anyone could be inside. Yet the sound persisted. Thud, thud, thud. She hesitated, then instinctively, she took a step forward. She couldn't turn back now, not after hearing that. With each step she took, the noise grew louder. It wasn't just footsteps anymore. It sounded like someone dragging something heavy across the floor. The hair on the back of Sarah's neck stood up. The closer she got to the door, the more intense the sound became. The house seemed to be alive, pulsing with some kind of strange energy. Sarah didn't know what she expected when she stepped inside, but it wasn't this. The door swung open with a low groan, revealing a hallway lined with faded wallpaper peeling at the edges. The air smelled musty, damp from years of neglect. Dust hung in the air like a veil, and the sunlight streaming through the broken windows barely illuminated the interior. The thudding sound had stopped. For a moment, Sarah stood motionless, trying to gather her thoughts. Her heart was racing, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch the doorframe. She took a deep breath and forced herself to step inside. The floor creaked under her weight as she moved down the narrow hallway, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet that covered the floors. The hallway stretched on for what felt like an eternity, but no doors or windows offered any way out. There was only the dim light and the sound of her own breathing. She couldn't explain it, but she felt like she was being watched. It was as though the walls themselves were closing in on her, and every creak, every whisper of wind seemed like something or someone waiting just beyond the corners of her vision. A door at the end of the hallway caught her attention. It was slightly ajar, as though someone had recently left it open. Without thinking, Sarah made her way toward it. As she reached out to push the door open, a cold breeze rushed past her. It was so cold that her breath came out in visible puffs, though the temperature in the house hadn't changed. Sarah hesitated, but pushed the door open anyway. The room beyond was dim, its only light coming from a single dirty window. There was a large, ornate mirror on the wall, its glass cracked and streaked with grime. The floor was covered in dust, and old furniture sat covered with white sheets, as though the house was stuck in time. But what caught her eye, what made her heart skip a beat, was the figure standing by the mirror. At first, she thought it was a reflection, but as she stared, she realized it wasn't. The figure was a woman, pale and gaunt, with long, dark hair hanging loosely around her face. Her clothes were old-fashioned, like something out of a Victorian-era photograph. The woman's eyes were locked onto Sarah's. "Get out," the woman whispered, though her lips didn't move. The voice came from everywhere, echoing around the room like 1,000 whispers, all saying the same thing. "Get out. Now." Sarah didn't know what to do. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. Her body refused to obey her mind. But then, with a flicker, the woman's form vanished. One moment she was there, and the next, she was gone. The room felt cold and empty, but Sarah's senses screamed at her to leave. She turned and ran, stumbling back into the hallway, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear anything else. She didn't stop to look back, didn't stop until she was outside, gasping for air under the open sky. The door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the woman's face, pale and lifeless, staring back at her. The voice echoed in her mind, a constant whisper urging her to leave. She tried to rationalize it. It was just a trick of the mind, right? Maybe she'd imagined the whole thing. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. The woman had been real. The next day, Sarah went back to the house. This time, she wasn't alone. She had called her best friend, Emily, to come with her. Emily had always been the more skeptical one, the one who didn't believe in ghosts or spirits. But when Sarah told her about what had happened, Emily's curiosity was piqued. "Okay, we'll check it out," Emily said, though she wasn't convinced. "But if we get freaked out, we're leaving." They arrived at the house in the afternoon, when the light was brighter and the air warmer. Everything about the house seemed different in the daylight. The front door was closed and there were no sounds coming from inside. It looked like an ordinary, abandoned house once again. But when they stepped inside, the air was colder, just like Sarah had felt the first time. And the moment they crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind them. "What the hell?" Emily said, her voice tight with fear. "That wasn't us." "No," Sarah replied, feeling the hairs on the back of her neck prickle. "It wasn't." The hallway was just as she remembered it, only this time the air felt heavier. The thudding sound from the previous day was gone, replaced by an oppressive silence. They moved down the hallway cautiously. The room with the mirror was still locked behind the door, but something felt different this time. The air seemed to shimmer. Without warning, the door to the room with the mirror swung open, as if inviting them inside. Sarah felt a cold hand brush against her shoulder, and when she turned around, no one was there. "Do you see that?" Emily whispered. Sarah nodded. The woman was standing in front of the mirror again, her eyes fixed on them, her mouth moving silently. "I told you," she whispered, and with that, the floor beneath their feet began to tremble. The walls cracked open, revealing darkness beyond. The whispers grew louder, as though the house itself was alive, feeding off their fear. "Get out," the voice said again. This time, it was more urgent. "Leave before it's too late." In that moment, Sarah knew she had made a grave mistake. She had come here too late, too curious. She hadn't been meant to see what lay hidden in the house. "Run," she whispered to Emily, grabbing her hand. Together, they bolted for the door, but no matter how fast they ran, the exit seemed to move further and further away. When they finally burst through the front door and into the yard, the house behind them let out a deafening scream. It was as though the house itself was in agony. But they were free. The house still stands, abandoned and empty, waiting for the next curious soul to come too close. Waiting for the next whisper to draw them in. Story the end.
Story number 8.
I didn't believe in ghosts when I first moved into the house. I had always considered myself a practical person, someone who relied on logic and evidence rather than superstition. But that was before I moved into the old farmhouse on the edge of town. It was a beautiful place, surrounded by rolling fields and dense woods, far away from the noise of the city. The previous owners had left it at a good price, claiming it was too much to maintain as they had gotten older. The house was perfect for me, quiet, spacious, and surrounded by nature. I was looking for peace away from the chaos of my daily life, and the farmhouse seemed like the ideal escape. The first few days were uneventful. I unpacked, settled in, and started exploring the house. It was large, with creaky floors and high ceilings that gave it a haunting charm. The smell of dust and aged wood was thick in the air, and I found myself constantly opening windows to let in the fresh breeze. I loved the way the sun poured through the tall windows, casting long golden beams of light across the rooms. The house felt old, but it had a certain warmth to it that made me feel at home. But then, on the third night, things changed. I had gone to bed early, tired from the long day of unpacking and cleaning. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards or the wind howling outside. I had just drifted off to sleep when I was jolted awake by a loud thud from downstairs. It was so sudden and so intense that it made my heart race. I lay there in the dark, straining to hear any other sounds, but the house was silent again. For a moment I wondered if it had been a dream, but it felt too real to be imagined. I convinced myself that it was just the house settling. After all, it was old, and old houses have a way of making strange noises. I went back to sleep, but that night marked the beginning of something I couldn't explain. The next few nights, the noises continued. At first, it was just the occasional thud or creak, but then I began hearing footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom door. Slow, deliberate steps as if someone was walking up and down the hall. I'd get up to check, but when I opened the door, the hallway would be empty. Nothing but shadows and the faint echo of my own footsteps. It was strange, but I still told myself it was just the house making its old noises. But then, one night, things escalated. I had just finished watching a movie and was getting ready for bed when I heard a soft whisper, just barely audible, coming from the hallway. I froze, my blood running cold. It wasn't the wind or the house settling. It was a voice, a quiet, distant voice, almost like it was right outside my door. I held my breath, straining to listen, but it was gone as quickly as it had come. I thought I must have imagined it. After all, I had just watched a scary movie, and my mind was probably playing tricks on me. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence of the house. And then, just as I was about to drift off, I heard it again. The soft whisper, this time clearer, as though it was right next to my bed. I could make out a few words. "Help me." My heart nearly stopped. I shot up in bed, my breath coming in short gasps. There was no one in the room, but the air felt heavy, like something was there. Something watching me. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and scanned the room, but it was empty. I rushed out of bed and checked the hallway, but there was no one there. Just the dark, empty space stretching down the long corridor. I tried to tell myself that it was nothing, that I was just imagining things. But as the days passed, the strange occurrences continued. The whispers grew louder, more persistent. I would hear them at all hours of the day and night, always just on the edge of my hearing. Sometimes they sounded like a woman crying. Other times they were indistinct murmurs, as if someone was talking to themselves. But every time I would investigate, the house would be empty. The air would feel cold, but no one would be there. One afternoon, I decided to take a walk around the property, hoping that the fresh air would clear my head. The farmhouse was situated on a large plot of land, surrounded by fields and dense woods. There was a small barn in the back, and beyond that, a pond that looked peaceful in the afternoon light. As I walked toward the pond, I noticed something strange, a path leading into the woods, partially hidden by overgrown grass. It seemed to be an old trail, one that had been forgotten over time. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to follow it. The path wound through the trees, twisting and turning until I lost track of time. The further I walked, the more I felt like I was being drawn towards something, as if the land itself was calling me. Eventually, the path opened up to a clearing, and in the center of it, I found a small, dilapidated graveyard. The gravestones were old, covered in moss and ivy, and many were so weathered that the names had faded beyond recognition. I stood there for a moment, taken aback by the sight. I had no idea there was a graveyard on the property. I started walking through the graves, scanning the worn stones. Most of them were too old to read, but one in particular caught my attention. It was a small, simple stone with the name Elizabeth engraved on it, along with the date of death, 1894. Beneath her name were the words, "Rest in peace, my love." There was something about the gravestone that felt off. It was as if the name Elizabeth was calling to me, pulling me in. I knelt down, my fingers brushing the surface of the stone, and I felt an overwhelming sense of sadness wash over me. As I sat there in the graveyard, I began to feel like I wasn't alone. The air grew colder, and I heard the faint rustling of leaves behind me. I turned around, but there was no one there. I stood up quickly, my heart racing. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. It was then that I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The path I had walked down was gone. The trees, the clearing, the graveyard, it was all gone. I was standing in the middle of a dense, dark forest, the only sound the beating of my heart in my ears. Panic set in as I realized I had no idea how to get back to the house. I ran, pushing through the underbrush, calling out for help, but no one answered. The trees seemed to close in around me, and the shadows grew longer. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stumbled through the forest, disoriented and terrified. After what felt like hours, I finally saw a faint light in the distance. I followed it, my legs aching, my body shaking with fear. When I emerged from the woods, I found myself at the edge of the property, right near the farmhouse. But something was different. The house was darker, the windows clouded with a strange mist. I walked toward the front door, but when I reached it, I found it locked. I knocked, but no one answered. The house seemed abandoned, as if no one had lived there for years. A chill ran through me, and I realized that something was very wrong. I ran around the house, trying all the windows, but they were all sealed shut. I was trapped. I could hear faint whispers again, growing louder, as if they were coming from inside the house. I tried to scream, but my voice was swallowed by the wind. Suddenly, the door opened, and I found myself face to face with a woman. She was dressed in an old-fashioned gown, her hair long and dark, her face pale and gaunt. Her eyes were hollow, as if she hadn't slept in years. "Elizabeth," she whispered, her voice cold and hollow. "You shouldn't have come here." I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. But before I could react, she stepped aside, and I found myself standing in the doorway of the farmhouse once again. The house was quiet, but it felt different, as if it was watching me, waiting for me to understand something. The whispers continued to echo in my ears, a reminder of something I couldn't escape. Story the end.
Story number 9.
The old house sat at the edge of the woods, a crumbling relic from a time long past. No one had lived there for years, but stories about the place had lingered in town for generations. The locals called it the Hollow House because of the eerie silence that seemed to consume it, even in the loudest storms. It was a place you avoided, even in the daytime. The ones who ventured too close never came back the same, or at all. Megan had heard the stories all her life. Her grandmother used to warn her about the Hollow House when she was a little girl, telling her to stay away from the woods and to never get too curious about old, abandoned places. But like most children, curiosity had a stronger pull than caution. As she grew older, she heard the same chilling stories, but dismissed them as nothing more than ghostly tales meant to frighten young minds. That was until the summer of 2007. Megan, now in her mid-20s, had returned to her small hometown after years of living in the city. She had a small apartment just a few streets away from her grandmother's old house. Her grandmother had passed away the year before, leaving Megan with the task of cleaning out the old home, which now felt strange and empty without her. It was during these quiet, lonely days that the stories began to resurface in her mind, the ones she had heard as a child whispered in the corners of her memory, the ones that haunted her. One evening, Megan was sitting on her grandmother's porch, staring at the woods that bordered the property. The sun had long set, and the stars above sparkled in a dark velvet sky. Her grandmother had always warned her not to go into the woods after dark, but she felt a pull she couldn't explain. It was almost as if the woods themselves were calling to her. So, despite the warning, Megan decided to take a walk. The path to the woods was overgrown, almost forgotten by time. The air was cool, and the only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath her boots and the distant call of an owl. She walked for a while, deeper into the woods, the trees thickening around her until the moonlight barely reached the ground. It was then that she saw it, a structure barely visible through the dense underbrush. The Hollow House. Megan's heart raced. She had seen pictures of it, heard stories about its history. It had been abandoned for decades, ever since the last of the Carter family had mysteriously disappeared. The rumors said they had gone mad, that something in that house drove them to insanity. But Megan couldn't resist. She stepped closer, drawn to the house like a moth to a flame. The windows were dark, empty, as if no one had looked out of them in years. The door hung crookedly on its hinges, inviting her to enter. Megan hesitated for a moment, but then pushed the door open. It creaked, an eerie sound that sent a shiver down her spine, but she ignored it and stepped inside. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of mildew and dust. The wooden floorboards groaned under her weight as she slowly moved through the rooms. Her flashlight cast long shadows across the walls, illuminating faded wallpaper and cracked furniture. There was a sense of abandonment here, of long-forgotten lives. But something else lingered in the air, something colder, more unsettling. She moved through the house cautiously, the feeling of being watched growing stronger with every step. Her mind raced with the stories she had heard as a child, the whispers of strange noises, flickering lights, and glimpses of shadowy figures, but she told herself it was just her imagination. It had to be. Then, she heard it. A soft whisper like a breath against her ear. Megan froze. The sound came from upstairs. She told herself it was the wind, or maybe an animal, but something in her gut told her it was more. Hesitantly, she ascended the creaky staircase, her flashlight trembling in her hand. At the top of the stairs, the air grew colder. She could see her breath in the faint light. The hallway stretched before her, dark and oppressive. Megan stepped forward, drawn by the sound of the whispering, though she had no idea where it was coming from. As she moved down the hallway, the whispering grew louder, more distinct. It was a voice, though she couldn't make out the words. She approached the end of the hall, where an old door stood ajar. The door was painted a faded blue, chipped and worn from years of neglect, but it was the faint glow of light coming from the crack in the door that caught her attention. Without thinking, she pushed the door open. The room inside was small and bare, with only a few pieces of furniture covered in thick layers of dust. The strange thing, however, was the light. It wasn't bright, but it was there, glowing softly in the corner of the room. Megan's eyes narrowed as she stepped closer, the beam of her flashlight revealing a large, ornate mirror on the wall. The glow was coming from within it, as if the mirror itself was somehow alive, pulsing with an unnatural energy. She took another step forward, and then, as if from nowhere, the whispering grew louder, now forming words, chilling words. "Leave. Now, before it's too late." Megan's heart pounded in her chest. Her breath quickened as she turned toward the door, ready to flee. But the door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. She spun around, the room spinning with her. The mirror's glow intensified, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch toward her. Then she saw them. Figures, translucent but unmistakable, faces twisted in agony, hands reaching out, beckoning her. Megan's scream caught in her throat as the cold from the mirror wrapped around her like a vice, freezing her in place. Her flashlight fell to the floor, its beam flickering out. "Get out! Now!" The whisper came again, this time clearer, more urgent. She felt something icy brush against her skin, and for a split second she thought she saw a face, one that looked like her own, but older, more worn, and filled with a deep, aching sadness. It was as if the house was showing her a future she could not escape, one where she too would become a part of the mirror's twisted collection. Megan's body froze in terror. Her mind screamed for her to move, to escape, but her legs wouldn't obey. The figures in the mirror reached out further, their ghostly hands almost touching her. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The glow from the mirror faded, the whispering ceased. The air was thick with an unsettling silence. Slowly, cautiously, Megan backed away from the mirror. The door, which had been slammed shut moments before, now stood wide open. Without thinking, she bolted from the room, down the stairs, and out the front door into the night. She didn't stop running until she was far from the house, gasping for breath, her heart racing. Her legs felt like lead, but she kept going, not daring to look back. The chill of the night air seemed to follow her, seeping into her bones. The hollow house had its hold on her now. Megan never spoke of what happened that night. She never returned to the woods or the house. But every so often, when she was alone, she would catch a glimpse of something, just out of the corner of her eye, a reflection that wasn't her own, or a whisper that seemed to come from nowhere, a warning. The hollow house was still waiting for her. Story the end.
Story number 10.
It was a late autumn evening when Amanda first noticed something strange in her new home. She had just moved in, excited about the fresh start after a messy breakup. The house was an old 2-story, creaking with age, but charming in its way. A bit of fresh paint, a few new carpets, and some furniture, and it was all ready to begin her new chapter. The air had a chill to it, the kind that reminded her of her childhood, and it gave the house an odd, inviting feeling. The scent of old wood and dust lingered, and Amanda couldn't help but notice the worn, intricate moldings along the walls. She loved the history of the place. There was a quiet beauty in its imperfections. Her first few nights there were uneventful. The house creaked as any old home would, settling under the weight of time. She'd hear the wind howling through the cracks of the windows, and at times the house seemed to hum with the kind of energy she couldn't quite place. But she brushed it off as nothing. A draft, the house settling, whatever it was all easily explained away. That was until the fourth night. She had been cleaning up in the kitchen, humming to herself as she wiped down the counters, when she heard a soft sound from upstairs. It was the unmistakable creak of a floorboard. Her heart skipped a beat. Amanda was sure she had closed the door to the spare room when she moved in, but she hesitated for a moment, listening. The sound came again, slow, deliberate. She grabbed a broom from the kitchen, the only weapon within reach, and slowly ascended the stairs, holding her breath. The creaks grew louder with each step she took. Reaching the top, she moved towards the spare room. The door was slightly ajar. She pushed it open, expecting to find nothing but dust and boxes. But as the door swung wide, her breath caught in her throat. The room was cold, frigid in fact, and a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered. The temperature shift was noticeable, like walking from one atmosphere to another. In the corner of the room stood a rocking chair, slowly moving back and forth as if someone had just gotten up. But there was no one there. Amanda's heart pounded in her chest. She stepped forward, her feet barely making a sound on the hardwood floor. The air was thick, charged with something she couldn't explain, something that made the hairs on her neck stand up. Then it happened. A low, almost imperceptible whisper drifted through the room. It was so faint she almost thought it was her imagination, but it was real. It was unmistakably a voice, one that didn't belong to her. "Help me." The words were soft, almost pleading. Amanda froze, her eyes darting around the room, her breath quickening. She slowly backed away from the chair, but the feeling in the room intensified. The air seemed to constrict around her, and the whisper came again, louder this time. "Help me." Without thinking, Amanda rushed down the stairs, out of the room, and into the safety of the living room. Her pulse was racing, her mind spinning. She couldn't make sense of what had just happened. She told herself it had to be her imagination, tired from the move, stressed from everything going on. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. That night, she couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind, every sound seemed to echo through the empty rooms. Her mind raced, her heart never settling. She tried to convince herself that it was nothing more than the quirks of an old house, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching her. In the coming days, Amanda began noticing more things. At night, she would hear faint footsteps in the hallway, the soft padding of bare feet crossing the wooden floor. The rocking chair in the spare room would move on its own, just like the first time. Sometimes she'd hear the sound of distant laughter, faint and childlike, echoing through the house. She wasn't alone. One evening, after returning from a long day of work, Amanda came home to a silence that felt too still, too thick. She hesitated before stepping inside, a chill running down her spine. The moment she crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind her, as if the house itself had rejected her entry. Her breath caught in her throat, and she glanced around. There was nothing to explain it. She quickly made her way to the living room, but that's when she saw it. The painting on the wall had shifted. It was an old oil painting she had found at a thrift shop, a quiet, eerie landscape of a riverbank, the trees twisted in a way that made them seem alive. But the painting was no longer straight. It was crooked, as if someone had deliberately turned it. As she moved to straighten it, her eyes caught something else, something in the background of the painting. A figure, barely visible, standing on the riverbank. A woman, her face obscured by a veil of shadows, but her form unmistakable. Amanda's stomach dropped. She hadn't noticed the figure before. Something had changed in the house. Something was waking up. That night, Amanda couldn't shake the sense of dread that followed her. She tried to sleep, but kept tossing and turning. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the image of the figure in the painting. She couldn't escape it. Around 3 a.m., the silence in the house shattered. A loud crash echoed from upstairs, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy dragging across the floor. Amanda leaped out of bed, her body trembling with fear. She grabbed her phone, half expecting to see a message from her ex, but there was nothing. The house was silent once again. She crept up the stairs, the sound of the dragging becoming clearer as she approached the top. It was coming from the spare room, the same room that had felt so wrong the other night. She could hear the creaking of the rocking chair, the scraping sound as it moved on its own. When she reached the door, she pushed it open slowly, bracing herself for whatever was about to happen. Inside, the room was pitch dark. But as her eyes adjusted, she saw something move in the corner. A figure, standing next to the rocking chair. It was tall, almost skeletal in appearance, draped in shadows. The air was colder than it had ever been, so cold Amanda could see her breath clouding in front of her. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came. The figure turned slowly, and Amanda's blood ran cold. The face was pale, gaunt, and sunken, with eyes that were dark pools of emptiness. The figure reached out a hand, its fingers long and twisted, and Amanda couldn't move, paralyzed by fear. "Help me," the voice whispered again, a rasping, desperate sound. With a sudden burst of energy, Amanda sprinted down the stairs and out of the house, not looking back. She didn't stop running until she reached her car. Her heart pounded in her chest as she slammed the door shut and sped off into the night. She never returned to that house. It stood there, empty and silent, waiting for the next occupant to come. Amanda couldn't shake the feeling that the house wasn't just old. It was haunted. There were things in that house, things that had been waiting for someone to hear their pleas, and she was just another chapter in its long history of secrets. Story, the end.